Hello, dear participants, dear listeners. Welcome to the Paris Peace Forum's discussion on fostering the tech for good, where we concentrate on the social role and responsibility of the tech sector. We could take various approaches to discussion. There is the responsibility of the carrier service provider, for example, making sure our networks are built so we can trust them, trusted connectivity, as described by Blue Dot or Building Back Better World. Or we can concentrate on what runs inside our communication networks means, the plethora of internet-supported services of our connected world. Or we could look at the aspects of making sure said services can be seamlessly but safely provided on global services market. How to do it without jeopardizing security and privacy and respecting each and everybody's right, and so on. Since our panel today represents content side of responsible tech, we are going to talk about those aspects. To be fair, these are indeed the most complicated issues. After all, setting standards for trusted connectivity, as far as grid construction is concerned, should be relatively straightforward, if there is sufficient political will. But how to achieve benign content? How to make sure our human rights, our rights to our personal data, or even our right of not to be robbed of our assets online can be built into global internet services economy without regulating it to death, without erecting market barriers via various and varied regulations? The answer seems to be that we need to try and attempt a consensus among policymakers, businesses, consumers, about how we do provide for safe services which do not run roughshod over our human rights in general, or data rights in particular. Or to put it really simply, we all expect a certain behavior from fellow human beings in the real world. How to get to the place where humankind collectively applies the same good manners to what goes on online? Or do we even have to work towards this objective, as a young generation does anyway not differentiate the world into analog and digital? In the latter case, how do we make sure that the good habits of analog space will prevail in digital one, while current tendencies, I think, are rather the opposite? Risks of the real life are amplified by the ease with which ideas threatening our societies are spread and shared online. Our panelists today represent the global goodwill to make internet safe, applying a certain set of principles. We have Tech Ambassador of the Kingdom of Denmark, Anne-Marie Engtorff Larsen. And then we have 3 people representing 3 projects from the 80 project long list of the Paris Peace Forum for 2021. They are Peggy Hicks, representing PTAC project, which helps global internet community to apply UN guiding principles on business and human rights. Then we have Karim Lesina, representing Digital Declaration Project, which unites CEOs from across industry sectors who are committed to acting ethically in the digital area. And Johnny Shipp, Executive Chair of the Internet Commission, which has put forward an Accountability Report 1.0, presenting its independent review of how organizations take decisions about content, contact, and conduct online. I hope to learn a lot from you all in the next hour or so, and to get the discussion flowing, I would ask you first to give us your insights on the intriguing issue which must be bothering many in our auditorium. Why do we have so many challenges making tech sector truly responsible? And why does it seem to be that different from, let us say, making auditors more responsible after Enron scandals or banks more responsible and transparent after the financial sector crisis of the last decade? What are the specific challenges? I guess all of us can talk for hours, but as we know, a few concise minutes are better received by grateful audiences. So please try to tell us your ideas in a nutshell in 3 or 4 minutes, and then we will try to engage in our open conversation among panelists and finally take questions from the audience. As this is virtual panel, the contactless and safe way to ask the questions is the live chat platform. And I will then make sure these questions will get an answer. But to make it easier, please indicate who you guess might be the one you are addressing your question to. So I thought I will start with Anne-Marie Entoff-Larsen, Madam Ambassador, because you are a little bit of a different school than the rest of our panelists. So what are your thoughts? Why is it so difficult?
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here with this distinguished panel and with you. Look, I think fundamentally, it is not baked into businesses necessarily to be societal responsible. There are multiple other ways that businesses work and operate. Some in their very design become very responsible because they make technologies, products, or services that we, I think in a societal perspective, somehow find more responsible. But at the end of the day, we need to think about what are these sort of simple incentives behind any business. And often it's about revenue, profit, doing well in the market. And unfortunately, we see that some aspects of technology, when they are amplified, when they are used, do have these negative sides. So I think the main question, and it goes to your question too before, I think your own example of Enron or these big moments in time that really changes how a tech sector or a different sector operates. In short, it is to say we need to nudge and change the incentives of how tech companies work. And if we look at the current tech sector, it is a very young one. It hasn't been around for more than a decade, 2 decades at maximum. And I think we're at the moment now, which is a bit of a point of no return. And it might not be our Enron moment, but now looking at the shadow sides, recognizing that there were challenges to this massive profit that's been made. And I'm definitely not against valuable, profitable companies, but it does come at a price. And so I think looking now at what might be some other incentives, how to design tech for good and how to have it as a key feature, not as a bug, how to have it as design, not by default, is really where we are right now. So in short, I think what makes me optimistic around it is that the challenges is very well discussed. The panel here today is one example of it. The massive focus that we've seen from governments on these issues is making us talk about how do we actually incentivize the tech for good. So I think we're at a place where we might actually be able to overcome the challenges.
Thank you. This was encouraging, to say the least. And maybe I will now turn to Mr. Johnny Shipp, Executive Chair of the Internet Commission. And maybe you could tell your view on the same question. Why is it so difficult? Or is it at all difficult?
Hello. Thank you for inviting the Internet Commission to participate in the Paris Peace Forum this year. I think it is right to say that the challenges related to internet content are particularly complex. So one reason is the wonderful diversity of service types and business models that exist online. Another is that online behaviors reflect all the existing complexities of social life, but also include additional and still, as has been said, relatively new online dimension through which people can harm one another. And the online environment is shaped by private interests, which makes it complicated too, and they haven't always been optimized to prioritize the greater good. So it is complicated, and I think anyone looking for simple answers will be disappointed. This leads me to say that in the conversations around the policy debates around tech regulation, an exclusive focus on the largest companies is really quite risky, because defining rules by the largest players and what they need to do could inadvertently entrench their dominance. I'll just say a little more about the Internet Commission for a moment. Over the last 2 years, we've worked with a wide range of stakeholders to develop and implement our independent digital accountability process. It acknowledges the diversity of companies in the digital ecosystem and focuses on asking the right questions, which often revolve around the key role of ethical business practice. So reflecting the previous comments already, so far we have worked with 6 organizations that offer services in broadcasting, gaming, dating, and education. So I think you're right. There are some lessons to be learned from the financial sector and from the previous crises as the regulations develop The big auditing firms will of course have a role to play, but can they be sufficiently independent, open, and indeed knowledgeable to ask the right questions? And that's what we're trying to be able to help with at the Internet Commission. To date, we've tested 122 evaluation questions about an organization's governance, moderation, automation and safety processes. And by the end of next year, we'll have at least 16 case studies identifying more than 100 key practices. And each of those practices we've been evaluating according to what it tells us about an organization's approach to digital responsibility and ethical business practice, or if you like, the extent to which the practices are congruous with a tech for good agenda. So we're asking, is the organization driven by checkbox regulatory compliance, or does it really focus on ensuring that its services and technologies have a positive social impact? So just to conclude, I'd like to say, again, it is indeed complicated, and simple answers must be risky. And mention that independently audited answers to the wrong questions could be quite distracting.
Thank you, Johnny. Thank you, Johnny. I'm quite sure we will come back to you and try to pick your brain a little bit more about this independent review and how this could really help companies who honestly want to and are committed to acting ethically in the digital area. But meanwhile, let's turn to Karim Lessina, who indeed represents the Digital Declaration project, which does unite these CIOs who are committed to acting ethically in the digital area. So why are you doing it? I mean, we've all concluded here that it's a tricky moment in time. It might be the Elron moment. Are you doing it because it's an Elron moment and you recognize that otherwise it's not possible to continue, offering these services without really being regulated to death? Or are you doing it because you do want actually the world to be a better place, even the digital world? Please, Karim, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and thanks to everybody for organizing this great event. Greetings from Miami. So look, I think what we need to look at is the principle of ecosystem, right? We all live in an ecosystem, and in ecosystem you have a lot of different species, if we can call it like this. And I think it's very important to differentiate. You know, we have the you have the telecom traditional world, you have that are made by the fixed and mobile operator, by the network manufacturers, and then you have all the new players. And I think when we talk about the lack of regulation and etc., we need to remember that some of us, specifically our sector of telecommunication, is a sector that is pretty well regulated and heavily regulated most of the time, while other sectors are probably a little less touched. I think that's the first part that we really need to look at. And I think the Digital Declaration demonstrates really the desire, but also the awareness of our industry, that we need to take a clear position and a clear stand on that. And when you look at the list of our CEOs that have been signing the declaration, you understand that this is not about a PR exercise, or this is not about us saying we need to do it. It's really taking control and taking ownership on this in order to insist on the consumer trust, in order to insist that our industry has something to play. So that's for me the most important one. And we need to look at every time the aspect between delivering growth for our investors, for our employees, for the economy where we are, the huge investments that are needed, we have Estonia here, which is probably the example on how digital can explode and get new economies into the new world. So this is the infrastructure base that needs to be done. But then obviously we have all the other discussions where we sit down with government, we work on best practice, we insist that we behave in the best way possible, and we collaborate in order to every time support environment that are supporting innovation. The other thing that I want to insist is this. We are in a sector that is changing faster than any other sector. And it's very difficult to know a sector where new technology comes every 2-3 years. So most of the time, whatever you want to do with regulation will be outdated. So it's very important to work on principles that people take the ownership to respect, to implement, and to control. Obviously, this is essential, and that's why we are really support the digital declaration of GSMA. I think it's a super important, a project that we need to really look at as an example. And we need to remember that whenever we develop a new proposal or new ideas, you need to be almost future-proof. We don't need to look at the world of today when we design the framework, the policy framework that we want to represent. We need to start thinking of what will be the world of tomorrow. Because if not, what happens is that you will keep the traditional regulation on the existing player like we have today, and you will never look at the framework that will potentially work well for the whole ecosystem as the ecosystem is developing. For me, that's the most important part. I've been in this sector for 25 years, and I can tell you that every time we start the discussion, we finish with some proposals that are almost impossible sometimes to implement, but the wind is changing. I think the beauty is the work between civil society, industry, political framework, regulators. People are really understanding that there are a lot of efforts that need to be done in that way. And for me, this is the most beautiful news. Because we will solve this together. You know, I have two young kids, and I know that when they will be 15 or when they will be 14, they will be in an environment that I hope will be much better than the one where, okay, when I was 15 and 14, there were probably no internet. But the reality is that that's what we have to look at as parents, but also as players, developing that framework that everybody has an incentive to play with the right way.
Thank you, Karim. Indeed, thanks for bringing out what I've also been thinking about a lot, actually, that our tech cycles are shorter nowadays than our legal cycles. I mean, we had 100 years to get our traffic code ready for the highways. Nowadays, we don't have that luxury anymore. And as we say here in Estonia, you have to legislate for singularity, then you are covered for every next step what the tech does. But how to achieve it, and how can also multilateral organizations, have a role in it and help us all together, governments, businesses, and consumers in it. So the floor is now yours, Ms. Peggy Hicks, representing PTAC project, which helps global internet community to apply the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. So Peggy, your turn now.
Thanks very much. So glad to be with all of you. And Karim, Johnny, and Anne-Marie have already brought up so much of the challenges that we face in figuring out how to really ensure that companies respect human rights in this rapidly evolving sector, as Karim has so eloquently put. You know, we've heard both the scope of technology, which affects all aspects of our lives, the speed, as Karim emphasized, and the scale of the challenge, in that so many of these companies are working across the globe and having impacts across many jurisdictions. And I think Anne-Marie spoke about why it's hard for companies. I think we also have to look at why it's hard for regulators. And the reality is they're really in a difficult position where they want innovation. We see innovation as crucial to addressing some of the world's global challenges. With COP26 going on, we all know what that means. But at the same time, we recognize and have seen that without regulation, there can be enormous and adverse human rights consequences to deployment of these digital technologies on every aspect of our lives. So we need to look at our institutions and our regulators fit for purpose. Do we really have the tools in place that allow us to act in this space? And that's where the project that you mentioned, that the UN Human Rights Office, where I work, has been trying to gear up. So the UN guiding principles on business and human rights were derived 10 years ago, adopted by consensus globally. And so they are, like the human rights framework, already agreed across all of these different regions, cultural contexts, political contexts. And so that gives them a real relevance in this discussion that can really provide a solid foundation for trying to find solutions to how we address some of the adverse impacts of digital technologies and really focus on how we use it for good, as you've said. So what our project is doing is really looking at how can we work with companies within the tech sector to really provide practical guidance on how they can address and look at potential adverse impacts from the technologies that they are designing, developing, and deploying. And they do that by doing what we call human rights due diligence, which means that before you jump in, you don't move fast and break things, as Facebook used to say, but instead you really look at what will be the impact of the technologies that you're going to deploy and try to make sure that you figure out what the impacts are and try to prevent and those potentially adverse impacts, or if they've already occurred, figure out how to mitigate them going forward. And we really think it's most crucial that we figure out how to do that in the areas in which these technologies can have the greatest impact on human rights. So really, when they have an impact on our health, on our freedom through criminal justice systems and elsewhere, that we really have to be careful and really make sure that we're doing these actions in the right way. Thanks.
Thank you, Peggy. And I'm listening to all of you, and it seems like we all agree more or less that legal space should not be reconstructed. What we already have for the analog space should simply be understood as our guiding principles also in the digital sphere. But then how do we get to this point that having recognized all this, we will collectively indeed apply this really good, set of rules which we do apply on our street space, like you do not yell on each other, you do not steal each other's assets, and so on, so on. And if it's so obvious, then why is it still not happening? Is it the corporate greed? Is human being really worse than we have been dreaming we are? What could it be? Or is it still something which the governments and regulators are overlooking and should be looking at more carefully to facilitate this kind of good behavior? Should we somehow then police our global internet space? How would we do it? Street space, we do not leave it alone. We do control it and we police it. We do not allow anonymity, for example. In digital sphere, we are still quite anonymous, and personally, I think this is a big problem. I don't know, what do you think, Anne-Marie, about all this? Is the government's role to be more proactive to then make sure that indeed all these good analog legal principles are applied?
I think there is a realization among governments right now that for the past decade, we haven't done enough. We are realizing now that regulating, legislating, setting the standards for the online space, we simply haven't done that well enough. The positive side is that you're starting to see governments across the world that are really waking up to this realization and saying, okay, we actually need to set the fundamental framework and rules of the road. And I think there are three things that the public sector is increasingly doing and ought to do even more. One is really saying, how do we make regulation in this space? Simply expecting that how we regulate offline will also happen online. We've seen now that doesn't happen by itself. That is why looking at the European Union forthcoming regulation, the so-called DSA and DMA, focusing on content regulation and on regulating competition is incredibly important because it sets the standards not only for 27 EU member states, but as we saw with the GDPR around privacy, also can have a really strong effect out in the world. And, I think about this a little bit as analog to the cars. When I grew up, no one used a seatbelt. There was no discussion around pollution filters. We didn't have the same safety around cars, but we mature also as regulators to think about how do we optimize the systems when many cars are in our cities, and now we're the same where many people are using technologies. They are becoming fundamental for our economic, for our social, for our democratic institutions. Secondly, there is this question of how do we incentivize behavior, because we're not going to have perfect regulation tomorrow. I think that would be incredibly naive of us to believe. So how do we incentivize the good behavior? And looking at the green transition over the past 30 years, we saw how from the public side, we can incentivize companies that have ventured into renewable energy, for example. We do that through tax exemptions. We can do that through nudging. We can do that through public-private collaboration on research. And we can do it by focusing also what are at stake for citizens and consumers of this. And then thirdly, because we are dealing with some technology companies that are incredibly big, bigger than any company we've ever seen, that are very much leading on everything from advertisement to our media to questions of our democratic discussions and dialogue online, we need to deal with them differently. And so one thing is regulation, the second is incentivizing, a third is around public-private partnerships. And what the Danish government is doing in this as part of a new Tech for Democracy project is also inviting in and saying, look, we're not going to get this perfect tomorrow, but we need to work together to make sure that we find some common agenda. And I think collaboration on pieces and how to make the internet more safe, secure, more democratic, more rights respecting, also in the short to medium run, as we as governments find out the very complex task of how to regulate this space, not only in our own jurisdictions, but on a global scale.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. And as you brought the green analogy and mentioned Europe, I would say that in green, we have gradually grown from incentivizing into enforcement, because, I mean, this is enforcement if we say that by 2050, the cost of CO2 is infinite in Europe. Therefore, you cannot anymore emit any CO2 in any production. So what to do that in the internet we could remain with this benign consensus building mechanism, that we do not have to move on to enforcement. I believe that both Johnny and Karim are very much interested in that. We do not need to get to this stage. Maybe Johnny, you want to start, and then I will ask Karim to comment also on the same issue.
For sure. I mean, it is about how ethical business practice can be inspired, and you've used the word nudged, and what incentives can be put in place by governments, but without, for rewarding good practice. And for that, I think good practice needs to be, perhaps the thing that needs to happen more is good practice needs to be defined and identified and promoted. So that's one of the things that we're doing with the Internet Commission. We're identifying these practices. We're enabling companies to exchange good practice in the areas of governance and content moderation and automation. And through that, I think it's possible to get a better sense of what good looks like, and to hopefully provide mechanisms which inspire ethical business practice rather than trying to enforce, which of course is very difficult.
Thank you. Karim, your thoughts on the same question?
So look, I think we have a big question in front of us, and I think Anne-Marie really went to the nail. We have a sector that is divided in different people. I can tell you that my sector, when my regulator wants to find me, he finds me the second after. I have a license. I need to respect those. I am locally based. I have my local employees wherever I operate. So the regulatory framework for our sector is pretty easy. Okay, when I talk about telecom, fixed mobile operators, MFS providers, and etc. Then you have another sector, much bigger, where obviously you don't have local legislation being able to adapt. And I think that's going to be the biggest challenges for policymakers, is how do you implement and you create a policy framework? Because what happened today is we are going to talk about a fantastic policy. We are going to write a fantastic policy at the European level. It's going to be a paradise. And then when you need to implement it, it implements all the time on the same players. And the others that will need to respect it are just find a way sometimes to avoid it. So that's a real challenge. I agree with Anne-Marie. Europe and the US have a huge possibility to set the standard of the future. They can use OECD, we can work at the United Nations, we can work at the European Union, at the Council of Europe level, and etc. But the most complicated thing most of the time is how do you enforce it, because enforcement is coming mostly from national level. And a lot of the national authorities don't have the capacity to enforce it, or a very limited capacity to enforce it on what are the wider and bigger players. Who, by the way, most of them are very good players who try to also respect, but sometimes it doesn't work with their business model. It doesn't work with how they define their priorities. So for me, that's going to be the biggest challenge we have in front of us, okay? Because I can tell you in Colombia, in Paraguay, in Bolivia, in Costa Rica, and all in our countries, the regulator knows exactly where to find me, and they know exactly how to implement those rules. But some of the people that are part of the whole ecosystems don't have operation. So I think we need to look at frameworks that are adapting to the nature of the changing industry, and where everybody of the ecosystem play by the same rule. I think that's the most important part. We need to be sure that there is not a different treatment between one and the other, because at the end, whatever you are competing on the same marketplace now. My competitor is my local competitor that can be America Mobile, but it can be also a lot of the big tech companies that are going after our customers with different business model. And it's complicated when I have to respect very, very strict legislation and very strict rules, and the others don't. And this is not the mythical regulate my competitor thing. I don't believe in that. I think the best should win in the market. I think it's let's create these rules that implement it the same way for everybody. And knowing that some are easier to implement than some specific people that have local operations, and some are more common. That's the reality.
Yes, I believe Anne-Marie and me also, we might be slightly more optimistic about light legislation or regulation, because we all have gone through of applying the GDPR here in Europe, and we've noticed that GDPR has developed into a de facto standard also globally, because no other big rich economy or economic region has anything comparable. So GDPR indeed seems to be prevailing in its thinking. So that's why we are a little bit more positive. But I wanted to ask also, what's your understanding of this issue that we're all talking about responsibility? And since you brought it up, Karim, you said your regulator knows where to find you. Well, I'm here sitting in Estonia, and when I go online, I go online and check in with my own digital identity. And each and everybody in Europe has the right to a digital identity, which means that gradually we are driving anonymity out of the cyberspace, making sure that people, can talk to each other knowing to whom they are talking. They are not talking to anonymous nicknames, but to real people. We have started to develop such a system. We have decided everybody has a right to a digital ID. Is that the way forward? And if that is the way forward, then why are we still discussing responsibility of a company? I think this is kind of a weird in a role management context, because in the analog world, if somebody, for example, fails to apply public procurement rules, then we are looking, who was this person? Maybe somebody took a bribe, it may have been a project manager. We are not automatically holding a company responsible. So couldn't this be the way forward, to drive anonymity out of the internet, at least to give people a possibility to know with whom they are acting and transacting, and getting the role management more correct also in the internet space? What do you think about it? And I think everybody else who wants to talk on this topic could also jump in, but it is more for a private sector, I believe, this discussion first. But just wave me if somebody from the public sector or multilateral wants to come in on that question. I think Anne-Marie, you're looking like you might, and then Johnny next.
Just 2 points. One, on driving anonymity out of the internet, it really depends on where you are. We've right now, as part of the Tech for Democracy project, we're working with activists across the world who are using the internet, who are using digital technologies to advance their cause on human rights and democracy in autocratic states. And their anonymity is what keeps them safe and what keeps them alive. And that is the huge challenge that we have around these technologies. One thing is, I sit here in Copenhagen today, and I can talk about very, high standards, high regulation, a government I trust. But that is not the same for all the users, the 3 billion users of Facebook across the world. And so how do we deal with that? And I want to point out one piece around this accountability mechanism. I think, and when we look at the tech sector, and we still got to recognize that the majority of the tech sector, the tech companies have been developed in mature democracies. And right now, this is really a matter of, are you going to be on the right side of history? Are you going to stand with democracies who are defending the rights of people who don't have the same rights in autocracies, in dictatorships, in places around the world where the technology can potentially be the harbinger for change, can be a very, very positive source of mobilizing. And right now, so I think when we talk about the accountability pieces, and this is not only about sort of transparency reporting, but this is about living up to very high standards around privacy, protection online, make sure that you're on the right side of history. This is not about tech companies versus mature democracies. I really see this as an opportunity between tech companies, democracies, those activists and civil society actors across the world who are pushing for more democracy, not less. And yes, because we do see also that autocratic states, they are very great at sometimes looking to European regulations and say, look what they did, we're going to do the same. An example is the German NetzDG regulation that is really about making sure that harmful or illegal content online is easily taken down. We've seen how some autocratic states have been very fast to say, we're going to do the same, but they're using it to really hamper down and shut down activists, shut down human rights, civil society organizations. So anonymity and all of these questions, they're not to say they're two different realities between sort of mature democracies and autocracies, but I think it is our role, responsibility, and our duty coming from democracies and setting governance standards that are protecting those, especially living in conditions where this is not a given.
Thank you. Johnny, you wanted to step in on that as well. Thank you. Please.
Thank you. I totally agree with this idea that mature democracies and good technology companies, let's say, should be in alliance. And the question of anonymity and digital ID, I'm afraid, is an example of one of those areas in which it's just too simple to say we need to get rid of anonymity, because the downside effects, both within the global north but also beyond in other societies, has been mentioned, it could be really damaging for individuals. And I also don't think it's necessary. I think I really appreciate the digital ID. I think that's a really good thing, but I don't think that it's necessary to insist that that's replicated directly into online services. What we do need is a level of collaboration and trust between the government and the big and the tech companies that are running anonymous services, such that the companies that do that can interface with the digital ID and make sure that bad behavior is rooted out. And that places the obligation at the door of a company operating an anonymous service to police it well and to make sure the right processes are in place. But I don't think it's necessary, if you have that, to eliminate the possibility of such anonymized services and have all the adverse effects on individuals that may ensue.
But couldn't it be, yes, Karim, you too, but I will react to it, and I think you might be interested in answering to that as well. I mean, cannot we then separate the services world into anonymous and personalized services? And why I'm asking it, actually in Estonia, all private and public sector companies do run digital ID-based services and on the same platform. And it has made Estonians to understand that there is digital for fun and digital for real, for safe acting and transacting. So could that be the way forward? And of course, Karim, you are free to answer to other issues as well.
Now, look, I will mix it in two, because I wanted to give the view coming from developing countries. Because we are talking about countries that today are still deploying technology. We still have a huge number of people that, it's not that they don't have a digital identity, they don't have a digital life yet. We are talking about countries where we are still deploying networks and we are still at the level of 60% to 70% of 4G coverage. We're talking about economy that are non-bunkerized at the level of 50, 60, 70%. So the reality is that I think there is a huge difference between what we can call developing. I hate that, my father is Italian and my mother is Tunisian, so I'm a mix of these two different economies. But the reality is, I think we need to look at projects to really cover and digitalize. There is a lot of education that needs to be done. And I think you in Estonia can be really the example for that. But I think there is a better practice that needs to be done in order to push that. I think the more we have governments digitalizing their system and look, for example, at Estonia as a role model, the more we will be able to get to this world discussion faster. Anonymity and the whole question about security is a huge one, but I think it's two different discussions that we need to look at because there is a huge part of education, huge part of education, and we are insisting like crazy in our region and focusing that in educating kids and educating teachers and educating mothers and fathers in how to use the technology in the most efficient way. So I think we need to look at that. And we need to divide some of the countries that have 90 to 95% of connectivity with everybody with a phone and with a real smartphone that can get them to internet and access to everything. And we need to look at the markets where you still have a huge amount of 3G phones, where 4G is the one that is getting deployed with very big difficulties because of very low revenues per user, very high costs, very old regulation, and etc. So before it's important to look at where we are in the world and how we divide that, in my opinion, and not try to implement models that cannot be implemented because of the lack of connectivity most of the time, or the huge difference between urban and rural, or urban or semi-urban connectivity zones. I just want to put my hat as let's say Central Latin America, but also as Africa, as a big part of Asia. Because, if not, we are going to try to take a recipe that global that will not go to local. And I think it's looking at best practice, trying to develop them and help a lot of those governments to develop those. These are long-term projects that most of the time don't fit into the 3-4 years plan of most of those governments when those governments are able to stay 3-4 years in power. And most of the time don't even have that capacity of digitalizing because of lack of resources, huge debts, and etc. So I think a big focus needs also to be there, if I may.
Yes. Thank you for bringing in the developing nations. I've already sneaked a peek into the question list which have been given to us, and one of them actually deals with tech transfer for developing markets. And indeed, you are right, many have bad connectivity, but on the other hand, if you use a platform which is not so data heavy, you can offer basic government services as you can offer M-Pesa. You don't need to have more bandwidth for that. So I'm quite hopeful, I have to say, about also, for example, African IT ambition and development. But indeed, we need to make sure that we pay attention to this kind of tech transformation to developing and emerging markets. And I believe this is the right point to turn then back to Peggy, who after all represents UN, who is the true expert on those issues. So Peggy, maybe you want to comment on that issue. What to do to bring the developing nations on board, how to make sure that we foster societies which are more benign to the citizens of those countries. And first and foremost, that which is always a question, if you are offering more digitalized services and supporting development of digital ecosystem in a country which is not respecting the rights, the human rights of their own people, are you not making an oppressive regime more efficient and effective? How to make sure that this does not happen, since we are talking here about the tech and the responsibility. So Peggy, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much. A lot packed into that question. I think we do need to go back to this question about what types of regulation we need. And your question gives a really good scope for that, in that when we talk about something like digital ID, which you've raised, it's all right to talk about digital ID. And I agree with everything Anne-Marie said about the issues around anonymity and encryption and how important it can be to protect human rights in certain settings. But the reality is we can't roll out these technologies without putting in place the necessary guardrails for protection. So my office, for example, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, has called for moratoriums on deploying certain types of artificial intelligence in sectors that could have an adverse impact on human rights, like in the criminal justice sector, until we have in place the types of regulation that is essential to protect and make sure that those technologies are being deployed safely. And I also wanted to pick up Kareem's point about the fairness across the industry. We need that type of regulation as well, not just to provide those guardrails for protection, but also so that we have those common standards, that companies are being held to the same level of protection and to secure greater public trust in what's happening here. Kareem may feel like his industry is overregulated or regulated quite a bit, but the reality is most of us as consumers are looking at the impact of digital technologies and saying, what's going on here? There's so much happening in this space in social media and elsewhere, and deployment of artificial intelligence by law enforcement agencies across the globe with limited regulation on it. We think there is a real need for additional regulation, but as several of the panelists have emphasized, it's not easy to get it right. And getting it right will be essential. And that goes to your point about the developing world. We really have seen, as Anne-Marie emphasized, that one type of legislation developed in one place can easily be replicated across the globe, and also can be replicated in situations where the sort of checks and balances of a robust judiciary, for example, aren't in place. So we have to make sure that when Europe is developing the DSA and its current work around mandatory human rights due diligence, for example, that those things are done in a way that makes sure that those models that are being developed can be deployed in the developing world effectively. But they also have to be the types of measures that really can be deployed at scale, don't rely on technology and capabilities that governments and actors in those contexts won't necessarily have either. And that's why when we talk about regulation, we really need to look at this question at three levels. Of course, there's the national level and the global standards that we've been talking about. But we also have to look at across the industry, so-called co-regulation. What do we expect from the companies themselves? And that is where, if we set real standards for how they deploy, and we need to go beyond ethics to actual obligations and things like within the guiding principles on business human rights, where we have specific guidance on how companies have responsibilities to mitigate and prevent harms from happening. So we need to do it at that level across the industry, and then we need to really expect more from each company in terms of how they implement and work on that. And one, Kareem also spoke about enforcement. One of the things that we've seen is that consumers and, in fact, employees of these companies can be a very important measure to push for enforcement and push for companies that are more socially responsible and more human rights respecting going forward. Thanks.
Thank you. Johnny, I'm thinking about it. Speaking about the developing markets then and the emerging markets, how do you make sure that there are no double standards concerning content, contact and conduct online? Is it part of your framework or matrix of analyzing in your accountability report?
I think that most of our work so far is done with companies operating not entirely in the global north, but I would say that's the focus of the ownership of those companies. But the systems and processes, what good would look like in terms of content moderation, and also I was going to mention about the automation of content moderation as well, the checks and balances that would be needed around the use of automated systems, the need for human oversight, the different ways in which AI and machine learning can be used in content moderation and is being used. I think that doesn't need to, but unless I'm mistaken, I don't think that needs to vary particularly between the global north and the global south. What we need to ensure is that users, wherever they are treated properly, that there's a move towards, that services are designed to encourage and reward good online behavior, which I think means that they would have agency, that users have a role in online environments, and that is baked into the design of services as much as safety and freedom of expression is as well. So I'm not seeing, like, between in terms of content control moderation practices, that there's a massive difference from our work in between the markets. Obviously, there's difference in propositions, but the fundamental issues about how to manage content and control content, and to drive helpful and positive online behaviour, I think is something that it needs to happen in a similar way at some level, at least. I think what we do is relate that to the responsibility of the companies operating it. And I just wanted to add one other thing to this idea that consumers may be demanding good behaviour from companies, and just to potentially bring in the idea of the role of investors in that as well, because I think it is in the interests of the owners of technology companies, in order for them to have a sustainable future, that they start to shift and align on sort of positive outcomes from their technology deployment. And so trying to kind of go into the question of how investors should support technology for good could be quite a fruitful area also for governments to support, I think.
Thank you. I have another relatively good question from our listeners, really, who are asking about education. And the question is it not that there is not enough emphasis put on the moral responsibility of IT professionals for a safe and just cyberspace, both during their education and also by their employers? It's an interesting question, because in Estonia, I find our startup sector, and we have a lot of startups, it's a country of 7 unicorns after all, I find them highly socially responsible, yet people ask these questions. So they must not see, this reflected in the service provision. So who wants to wave and answer this question first? Well, yes, indeed. Please go ahead, Peggy.
I think it's a good question as well, because I agree with you that we see a real interest on the part of IT professionals to do the right thing. But I think we have a problem in that there really is a disconnect between the tech sector and the technologist perspective, and from my perspective, the human rights and ethical perspective, and translating and closing and bridging the gap between those two worlds, and really talking about what it means to do good, and how we, what types of approaches can be brought in through techniques like human rights due diligence are what's needed. I think the other thing it's important to emphasize, of course, though, is the lack of diversity in the tech sector as well. And part of what will make the tech sector stronger is when it actually can bring in the voices from, a much broader range of people. In many environments, most technology professionals are men, and often men from particular backgrounds. So the broader sector would also really help us to have, I think, the types of approaches that we want to see in terms of moral or human rights respecting conduct within the companies.
Karim, I think you need to respond to that, but I'm sorry, Anne-Marie had a hand up first, so Anne-Marie goes first, then you.
I just think two quick points. One is, Peggy, you mentioned it earlier, this idea about, moving fast and breaking things. I think we also got to be realistic about that. Has been the narrative in the tech sector for quite a long time. Let's try things out and then we'll sort of work out the ethical sides later. We need to change that. Just like we've been doing with the energy sector, where we've been saying very hard, you got to phase out fossil fuels, and you need to invest heavily in finding renewables. And then the second piece is, when technology companies become incredibly big, you can be, one ethically conscious engineer sitting on a very, very small project, but the systemic impact of when your technology reaches billions of people across 190 different jurisdictions, this is not up to the individual engineer. This is really leadership responsibility. And so, yes, I think it's great that we're also now teaching. It's not only about engineering, it's also about ethics. It's about standards. It's about, social responsibility. It's about regulation. But we do got to come down to this is a leadership challenge. And this is something that we need to discuss and work. And I think also talk about accountability with the leadership of the tech companies. And that's why it's so important. It's not reduced to simply a matter of is the one engineer out of 1,000 doing the right thing, but there's a question about what the leadership is doing.
And to complement, yeah. So look, this is music to my ear. Education is all about what we do at EO on our ESG work. We are all about education, using different ways to bring educations to kids all around our markets. We have been trained since the beginning of the pandemic, 137,000 teachers with a project called Maestros Conectados. We created the first regional congress this week, that we did with more than 40,000 teachers connected. We have been training 600,000 kids on how to use internet in a more secure way and to understand how the system works. We just signed a big agreement with Real Madrid to implement the same process in a lot of the schools that they have around our region. So, for me, this is all about it. It's maybe because I come from a different background, and my mother was one of the first women that was allowed to go to university in Tunisia. So it's all about that. It's part of our DNA in Millicom Tigo. So I am all in, and I think we all should do that. It's a private sector has a huge role to play, huge, and we are there to do it. But public sector needs to be there and support us, work together, see how we can implement policies that get to all those kids. Because I think at the end, we will win this if we are able to bring a new generation with a better understanding. There are a lot of companies that are doing incredible project on coding that is also essential for people to understand the new languages. Because this is something we have a tendency to forget. We have to adapt some of the education system. We have to digitalize more. COVID has been a big wake-up call because a lot of the countries have noticed that they were far from digitalization, and they have been obliged to go fast with it. So after we learn from this, let's implement, let's use that lesson. One thing, and I promise I shut up, but this is for me, it's DNA, it's more than anything else. COVID taught us one thing, that business, civil society, and governments can work together to answer to a pandemic. I'm not talking about the health side, I'm talking about the digital part. Let's base it on that and continue even when the pandemic is finished. Let's really learn from that lesson and work all together, because at the end, digital is going to be the solution. Yes, it brings some challenges, I get it, but it helps people to be interconnected in a global economy, and it helps a lot of those developing countries, if we want to call them like this, to integrate and to find new opportunities. For me, this is the most important part. And if you look all around our region, a number of companies that are developing there, that are the answer, Mercado Libre, Clip, and Globant, we will get there. But education is core.
Thank you, Karim, so much. As always, when the discussion gets more and more heated, we start running out of time. So I really thank all the participants, and I will really leave this panel very much hopeful that we are all standing for the human rights and democratic rights online. We all think that our decision-making should be driven by our analog law space, which does foster benign behavior on a street space. And we all want to foster the same kind of good behavior online. And despite the fact that also on the street, where we have the legal space and also our moral habits, we still have crime happening. Despite that, we do trust that we are all mostly trying to achieve a benign space. The same goes for the cyberspace. We are also driven towards this safer internet where more rights are respected and nobody gets robbed of their assets as well, in unison, because we're talking here with people representing business, representing governments, and also representing multilateral bodies. So we are all standing together to achieve rather quicker than slower our dream, which is that digital space will prevail, digital space will develop as a safe space, and that finally, that the good ones, the democratic forces, will be the ones who define how our cyberspace is run. Thank you all for being with us. This was our panel on Tech for Good, and I wish you all a good continuation of the Paris Peace Forum of 2021. Hope to see you already in person maybe next year. But personally, I think these hybrid formats are here to stay as well. So thank you all. It was really good to talk to you. I learned a lot. Bye.
Bye-bye.